almost 40 years, I was employed full-time as a pastor in the United Church of Christ. So it's my privilege to talk about the history of this church this afternoon. It's always morning when you're a pastor. My theme is the little congregation that could. And I'm going to pass this picture around among you because I will be referencing that concept from Waddy Piper's beloved children's book many times. It is my contention, first, that this little congregation has surmounted many mountains like a little engine, but also that this congregation has been a driver, an engine, if you will, for much progress in this town. So, the church was organized in 1780, as you probably know. But the concept of having a church here in what was then the Northwest Territory of the town of Amherst goes back all the way to 1753. That's the first date when 32 members or residents of the Northwest Territory of Amherst petitioned the governor and the legislature to break off and become a separate town. And that was going to be their effort for many years because grass-spacious Amherst did not want to let them go. And I'm an Amherst resident. So the church is 239 years old if you count going back to 1780. If you think of the fact that they wanted to organize a separate town and you couldn't have a separate town without a Congregationalist church, the idea for this church goes back to 1753. I'm going to refer quite a lot to Charles Smith's History of Mont Vernon. You're probably familiar with that. He writes, "The pioneer settlers of Mont Vernon were a rough, hardy, worthy people. In many of them, the religious element was strong. Their attendance at church was regular, though the route was long and tedious. They had to go down to the Amherst Village Green, to the Amherst Congregational Church. What is that, 6 miles in each direction? Easier going down than coming back. They just dreaded that 12-mile round trip to worship. They wanted their own town. They wanted their own church." My next bullet point is called The Old Meeting House and the Great Escape from Amherst. The Northwest Territory members of the Amherst Church weaponized their church membership. They realized they had a vote. At least the men had a vote. So, down in Amherst, the pastor, Reverend Wilkins, was getting old and enfeebled. In many cases, maybe even most cases, the pastor would stay his entire career in one church. So Reverend Wilkins was planning on staying on, but he couldn't do all his duties, so he wanted an assistant minister who would probably learn the ropes and then take over from Reverend Wilkins when he either died or just became totally enfeebled. And the Mont Vernon residents of the Amherst Church voted as a block to block the candidates that were proposed for assistant minister. The first one was a Mr. Blydenberg, who ultimately withdrew his name when he saw there was so much opposition from the Northwest Territory. The second one was a Mr. Bernard, also equally protested against, but he was seated. And that was enough for the folks from Amherst. 1780, they started building the first meeting house, which I'm sure you know is the town hall across the street. They started worshiping in the old meeting house, even though there was no floor, even though there was no heating system, even though there were no pews. But Charles Smith writes, there was plenty of ventilation due to the rattling windows. He also writes, they were warmed by the prospect of heaven. because there was a church building, because there was regular worship and a congregation, the next time they appealed to the legislature and the governor, 1781, they were made into a separate town. So the little congregation that could was a driver for the establishment of this town. Next bullet point, longest pastorate cut short. Now, our church records say that the Reverend Ebenezer Allen was the first settled pastor here. But Charles Smith doesn't bother to even mention him in his history. Could be because Reverend Allen only stayed 1 year, 1783 to 84. I wonder if the issue wasn't financial. The little congregation was paying him today's equivalent of $1,300 for his services. Or they had the option to pay him in 20 cords of wood. Maybe that was enough for Reverend Allen. He left. He was followed by a gentleman who had the longest pastorate here, the Reverend John Bruce. He served for 25 consecutive years until he died unexpectedly at age 51. And Charles Smith says this about Reverend Bruce. This is the only time I will read extensively from Charles Smith. But I thought it was interesting to get a perspective on how Reverend Bruce was viewed. He was meek, pious, and humble, kind, gentle, and easy to be entreated. He became all things to all men, that if possible he might gain some, quoting Paul there, while at the same time he steadfastly adhered to the faith once delivered to the saints. He possessed in eminent degree that charity which suffereth long and is kind, which beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things, quoting Paul again. But the most distinguishing traits in his character, next to his love of piety and religion, were his prudence and peaceable disposition. He was prudent and discreet in all things, and eminently entitled to the appellation of peacemaker. These virtues were so conspicuously displayed in him that he had not a personal enemy in the world. So apparently Reverend Bruce was something of a saint. Unfortunately, died young. He was followed by this gentleman here, who I think is the most interesting of the early pastors. That's the Reverend Stephen Chapin. Stephen Chapin was a Congregationalist preacher. He previously had served the church in Hillsborough, New Hampshire as a Congregationalist preacher. He apparently was a super engaging preacher because in his 9 years of ministry at this church, he received 151 new members. 54 new members in 1 year. Astonishing. Smith says of him, he was a sincere and true man of positive conviction, and bold, unadorned, and uncompromising in his style of preaching. His earnest, able preaching and stringent discipline made a deep impression on his people. All hearts were completely united with him. But Reverend Chapin came to be convinced that the Baptist position on baptism was the right one, and the Congregationalist position on baptism, we baptize infants, Baptists only baptize older, generally teenagers or adults, became convinced that the Baptist position was theologically correct. So he engaged in a series of pamphlet wars with Reverend Humphrey Moore, who was a longtime pastor down in Milford, another towering figure, another Harvard man like Chapin. And in 1818, Chapin became convinced that he couldn't continue as pastor of a Congregationalist church with this big disagreement about baptism. So he resigned and he took a Baptist church in North Yarmouth, Maine. After 6 years in North Yarmouth, he was called to be professor of theology at Waterville College, Waterville, Maine. You might know that Waterville College is today Colby College. He served there for a period of time. He was a beloved professor. And in 1828, he was called to be the second president of Columbian College in Washington, D.C. It's kind of interesting to me that he followed Reverend Bruce, who had died while serving, and the first president of Columbian College, whom he followed, also died while serving. I don't know whether they thought, hey, this guy knows how to deal with, dead, anyways. I kind of wonder how he interviewed for a job in Washington, D.C. when Waterville, Maine is 600 miles away, in a day when communication and transportation and travel were extremely difficult. But he became president of Columbian College. And Columbian College has morphed into George Washington University today. So if you're interested in the early years of Columbian College, I've got the George Washington University history that they published on the 175th anniversary of their founding. Okay, so he served as president of Columbian into 1841, and then he had to retire to a Maryland farm due to ill health. Big deal, right? College president? Well, the George Washington University says this about Columbian College. It was a small, underfunded, and neglected stepchild of its Baptist founders. Maybe not such a big deal. The year before he came as president, the entire faculty resigned en masse. The college was closed for one semester. His salary as a college president was about 2 1/3 times that which he would have earned just as a pastor at some New Hampshire village church. But he was given a couple of acres to grow vegetables on the side, which he was allowed to sell to supplement his income. The college was in dire financial straits. Just a little bit about how much it cost to go to Columbian College in those days, which is maybe why it was in such dire financial straits. Every student paid $10 on admission. He, and it was all he's, paid $30 for the first term and $20 for the second term. He paid $25 a year for his food and $14 a year for his dorm room rental, and $3 for a library fee. But every student was wisely advised to bring $10 for his year's spending money. So, $85 a year to go to Columbian College, $66,500 a year if you pay full price to go to George Washington University today. How to solve the financial problems? Well, Chapin had an idea. You might have heard of the Smithson family from Great Britain that left an endowment of the equivalent of $12 million in today's money to start an educational institution in Washington, D.C., the Smithsons. Well, Chapin very much wanted to get his hand on that $12 million from Columbian College. Or if he couldn't get it, he didn't want it to be used by some other new institution that could be a rival. In his endeavor to get the $12 million for Columbian, he was in a battle with no less than John Quincy Adams. Adams, you might remember, only served one term. Andrew Jackson beat him. But he came back, you might remember, as a representative from Massachusetts and was serving in Congress. And John Quincy Adams had the idea of a Smithsonian institution in Washington, D.C. And eventually, Adams won out. Chapin did not get the $12 million, which is maybe why it's today called George Washington University and not John Quincy Adams College. But Chapin, through diligent effort, was able to put Columbian into the black during his term. So the little congregation that could played a part in the career of a college president who turned around a struggling institution and who jousted with one of the major figures in American political history. Next bullet point. (1830). The church turns Mont Vernon dry. You might know that public drunkenness and alcoholism was as big a crisis, maybe a bigger crisis, in the early 1800s in America, in New England, across the country probably, than the opioid crisis is today. This is what one academic has written about alcohol in American life. Many people believe that drowning a glass of alcohol before breakfast was conducive to good health. Instead of coffee, workers would take a dram of liquor at 11 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon, as well as drinks after meals to aid digestion, and a nightcap before going to bed. That's like 5 drinks a day. Women were as likely as men to be drinkers, although they did not consume in the same quantity. Children were routinely fed alcoholic beverages from an early age. If your kid was fussing, give him a shot of whiskey and he'd be quiet. Many communal activities were funded by alcohol, including house raisings, log rolling competitions, corn husking, harvesting wheat, quilting bees, weddings, and funerals. Even church-related events were accompanied by prodigious drinking. Perhaps nothing illustrates the tolerance for excessive drinking in the late 18th century as much as the heavy use of whiskey at ministerial ordinations, where considerable drinking and frequent drunkenness were the custom. It was a problem nationwide, and it was a problem in Mont Vernon. There were 8 taverns in this town for a population of about 800 people. Now, not all that whiskey was being consumed by Mont Vernon residents. This town was on a couple of major roads, and thirsty teamsters would be driving their teams up the hill or down the hill, and they'd stop for a drink. But in 1830, the church was the driver to turn Mont Vernon dry. So the little congregation that could weighed in on a significant public health issue and acted in a way that was good for the community. 1837. Why did the church cross the road? And I'm indebted to Anna for that line. You might know that for almost 60 years, the old meeting house was on this side of the road. Then in 1837, they chose to move it to the other side of the road because they thought it was less windy over there. I think it had something to do with the way the church was orientated. Maybe it was facing this way where the wind came up the hill and they turned it sideways. I'm not sure about that. But they perceived the other side of Route 13 to be less windy and moved the entire church. At the same time, they added a bell tower and the same bell that rings on the hour now. And they added an organ, which was the first time, I believe, they allowed instrumental music in the church. Am I correct about that?
I couldn't, the only reference, reading the town book, and it's not really organized in any shape or form. You pick up little nuggets here and there. One of the nuggets I picked up was how many times they brought up to vote, could we have a cello in church, please? Because up to then, there was no instruments allowed in these churches, and that was just too fancy and highfalutin. And you can imagine a whole bunch of hard scrabble farmers gathered together trying to sing. A little musical accompaniment would help everybody find the right note, or
Yes,
you know.
yes.
And as people became more and more educated, they could afford things like music lessons, and they got even more frustrated, and that's when they really started, please, can we just have, at least for practice, you know, have it up there, and maybe not during the services. And I think it was cited in our town history because it was like, isn't that ridiculous kind of notion, and that's why they bothered to cite it all. So there's no actual mention of when they first allowed that, but they do follow up with, by 1839, they had an organ for the
Yes.
church. So.
Yes. Yes. 1841, abolitionist stance adopted. Slavery, anti-slavery sentiments were very strong in New Hampshire, as we all know. Anti-slavery sentiments were strong in the greater Milford region, where the Hutchinson family singers, famous abolitionists, came from. But abolitionism was not universally accepted in New Hampshire in the 1840s. Witness this. A significant portion of the population, perhaps a majority, was either indifferent to or hostile toward the abolitionist movement, quoting someone else again here. An agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society was lifted from his knees and thrown out of a church in Northfield, New Hampshire, while leading an anti-slavery prayer. A Baptist deacon pounced upon and beat up two abolitionist speakers in Nashua. In Concord, two anti-slavery speakers were cursed and pelted with dirt, rocks, and gravel. One was hung in effigy. A school in Canaan, New Hampshire, the first school in the state to admit an African-American student, was dragged from its foundation by oxen and left a useless ruin on the side of the road. Its teacher was advised to leave town. All these happened around the same time that this church adopted an anti-slavery stance. So the fact that they came out publicly as a congregation against slavery was maybe more courageous than it would seem to us today. Perhaps their church could have been pulled, off its foundation and down the side of the road. So the little congregation that could courageously weighed in on one of the human rights issues of its time. 1847, Appleton Academy, first high school, starts in the church vestry. Actually, it wasn't Appleton Academy yet. It was just called the high school. It didn't become Appleton Academy until the building was built, and then McCullum Institute, and eventually Stern School, as you probably all know. But the first high school classes in town were held in the church vestry across the street, with one teacher, George Stevens, who was a junior at Dartmouth College, and just a handful of students. But it proved that there was an appetite for a high school education up here in Mont Vernon, and eventually led to the building of the school that is now the police department. 1896, the preposterous becomes possible. Toward the 1890s, the old meeting house across the street was in dramatic need of repair. Many parishioners thought it would be better just to tear it down and build new. But the idea of raising enough money to build a new church seemed preposterous. That's as Charles Smith describes it. Preposterous to expect a town of about 500 residents to come up with the money for a new church. Well, two sisters, Mrs. Richardson and Miss Stevens, offered a substantial down payment on a new building. with the understanding that the town was to raise the equivalent of $160,000 today. It seemed impossible, but as Smith puts it, there was a generous rivalry among former citizens, natives, summer visitors, and local organizations. And within 1 year, this building was up and completely paid off. The design is by Boston architect G. Wilton Lewis. Interesting guy who lost his arm in the Civil War, one-armed architect. It's very similar, probably also designed by Wilson, is the Isola Mansion on Hutchinson Road, and Anna has some pictures about that we'll look at later perhaps. Both buildings have the same fieldstone foundation, the same rich wood, the same round room. By the way, the foundation here was built from stones that parishioners brought from their fields. That's what you're seeing when you look at the foundation. Charles Smith speaks glowingly of the beauty and elegance of this church. At the dedication ceremony, Deacon William Conant said, "While some have thought that this church is too good for this little town on a hilltop, we regard it as none too good for the Master we love and the God we serve." The little congregation that could did the preposterous and built this church. That's a picture of Reverend Dr. Marlin Farnham. And Farnham was the student pastor here at this church from 1925 to 1927. He was a student at the Baptist Theological Institution in Newton, Massachusetts, which eventually merged with Andover to become Andover-Newton. He was a student, but he was also the sole pastor up here at this church. He met his wife Melba at Colby College, where they both attended. They lived across the street in the Purple Building while he was serving the congregation. And as soon as he graduated in 1927, he and Melba both were commissioned as Baptist missionaries to Japan. And there they served from 1927 till 1940 and 1941, respectively. War clouds were on the horizon. Seeing this, Melba left with their 2 surviving children. Marlin stayed on until 1941. Then he was offered a choice by the Japanese government. Either leave the country or go into a prison camp. He left the country. Good thing he did, because some missionaries did go into Japanese prison camps. Some did not survive the camps, and at least one was beheaded by the Japanese. That's not to say that the Farnhams escaped hardships. During their tenure as missionaries, their little 4-year-old son died because he was vaccinated improperly by Japanese doctors. He was given 4 times as much vaccine as he should have received for a child his size, weight, and age. They went without food, fuel, and clothing. They were believed to be spies by some. The rumor was they had a shortwave radio up in the attic of their house where they were sending secret messages to Washington, D.C. They were frequently visited by the Japanese secret police. Nevertheless, the Farnhams did not bear any ill will to the Japanese people. And in fact, after each one of them died, they were cremated, and their ashes were brought back to Japan, where they lie next to the 4-year-old child that they lost. I have spoken to Farnham's daughter, one of them. I've spoken to Farnham's granddaughter, one of them. Farnham's daughter married a Baptist missionary and served her entire career with him in India. Farnham's granddaughter was an ordained Baptist pastor herself, married to another Baptist pastor, and she served her entire career in Burma. 3 generations of missionaries from the Farnham family. 1927, father follows son. When Marlin was leaving, they asked him if he could recommend someone to be pastor up here. He said, well, what about my father? His father was a letter carrier in Melrose, Massachusetts, who was also a lay preacher for the Baptist denomination. He came up and he served 12 years, which is the 3rd longest pastorate in the church's history. Obviously, he did well. And it's interesting to me that the Farnham family is related to the Farnhams of Francistown, New Hampshire. There's still a Farnham homestead in Francistown. There are still some Farnham folks in Francistown. And they used to hold Farnham family reunions, including the Farnhams I've just mentioned, right here in the round room. So, 1987, we're closing in on today. The Arts and Crafts Church and the Arts and Crafts. This is called an Arts and Crafts style church, and this congregation has been very involved in the arts and crafts over the years. 31 years of hosting Messiah Sings here. Great blessing to the entire region, founded by Dawn Lyon and Laurel Thomas. 26 years of the Round Room Coffee House in this room that brings folk singers from all over southern New Hampshire once a month.
Tonight.
Yes.
Tonight here.
Oh, tonight, yes, they're here tonight, yes, yes. And that actually was started to raise money to refurbish these lovely stained glass windows, and it's just kept going. For 12 years, this church has hosted a vacation Bible school using the arts and crafts to teach about Jesus and the Christian faith to Mont Vernon youngsters. So, in summary, for 239 years, the little congregation that could has been a blessing to its community. It has promoted worship, public health, human rights issues, higher education, world missions, and the arts. All the while, it has had to overcome significant challenges, like establishing the town in the face of Amherst's opposition, like worshiping in a drafty, unfinished building, like moving a huge sanctuary across the street, like paying for a brand new sanctuary. And the Mont Vernon community has learned to turn to this church in difficult times. I think of a horrific event that took place 10 years ago this year. Of course, I'm referring to the senseless murder of Kim Cates and the attack on her daughter, Jamie. Extreme distress in this community over that event, rightly so. I was talking about this yesterday with a group of parishioners, and one parishioner, when we just began talking about it, began to cry again. The wounds are not completely healed. But when this awful thing happened in Mont Vernon, there was a vigil held here in this sanctuary. Kim's funeral was held here in this sanctuary. And a group of Amish from Pennsylvania, a group where 5 of their little girls had been murdered in a schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse, 3 more wounded, came up and was here for a weekend in this building, holding meetings, trying to help people come to grips with that horrible tragedy and how one can get through it and learn to live again. This church has been at the geographical, I think, if you look at the way the town is laid out, and also the spiritual heart of its community. It continues to be faithful to its mission statement, which is listed outside for everyone to see, hosting monthly community dinners that are well attended. A crew from this church goes over to the Nashua Soup Kitchen and serves meals there. A family from this church hosts birthday parties every month at the Salvation Army, so that the children who use that service get a little moment of joy in the course of their month. For 5 years, folks from this church went down to Appalachia on work missions. That was under Pastor Judy's tenure. So, all in all, and in summary, I believe that this is the little congregation that could overcome some significant challenges, that could be a driver for some real good in this community, but I also believe, through the grace of God, it's the little congregation that still can. And for your convenience, I listed all our Holy Week worship services. On the back of your book, there it is. Because Holy Week starts tomorrow, and we have a lot going on. So I will entertain questions if anybody has any. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Not about the church, but about the name of the town.
Maybe.
I have a foggy memory that it was